Hello and welcome to Season 5, Episode 9 of Solely Singleton. I'm your host, Brad. This is my co-host, Eric.
How's it going?
We've got an exciting episode for you guys today. We're going to be discussing an archetype breakdown of Green Ramp. So take a shot anytime I mention Plow Under. Without any further ado, though, let's actually jump in.
Sounds good.
Alright, Eric, to start us off, how about you define for us, what's a ramp deck?
The basic game plan is trying to accelerate how much mana you can play ahead of the normal curve that you would play. In cheating that acceleration, play something big, win the game.
So obviously when we talk about Green Ramp, we can't get very far without mentioning the mana dorks. We want to start off on turn 1 and 2 playing things out, like the classics Birds of Paradise, Llanowar Elves, Sakura Tribe Elder, maybe even cheating and using a Signet. And then you get ahead of the curve to the point where you can drop down some fatties, some big dumb 6+ drop like Carnage Tyrant, Hornet Queen, something like that that'll end the game quite quickly, or at least put your opponent so far behind that they're never going to be able to catch up.
Right, they're kind of things that your opponent has to answer or they're just going to die.
And that's the basis of it, but we'll break down what key cards exist in each category, classic examples you can expect to see in a normal cube.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those, like, every cube's going to have slight variations, but the same game plan exists. So I guess let's just hop right into talking about the mana dorks. So these are the creatures that are going to tap for additional mana to accelerate your curve.
So we have Birds of Paradise as the classic example.
Yeah, it's one of the generic good ones. Turn 1 play, it taps for any color, so it's fixing and it's ramp.
We've got Green Soul Ring in Joraga Tree Speaker with a whole bunch of text on it that sums up to pay a green now, pay 1 and a green later, and then it taps for green.
Yep, basically. That one's pretty good. We've also got classics like Noble Hierarch, which is green for a 0/1 Exalted that can tap for green, white, or blue. And, I mean, there's just all of the Llanowar Elves, Elvish Mystics, those elves that tap for a green, or Arbor Elf, which untaps a forest. They're all the green for a creature that can tap to add a mana.
And these are all the perfect turn 1 plays that we really want to see in a ramp deck. They're the things you hope don't get immediately solved by your opponent.
Right, the old Bolt the Bird.
Bolt the Bird is not good for the person who played Bird.
Not usually, no.
It's usually a sign of things to come in the match.
Yeah. So that sums up the 1 mana dorks. There's also some pretty decent 2 mana dorks. So we're looking at things like Sylvan Caryatid. And this one's pretty nice because they can't bolt it. It has hexproof.
We also have other classic ones like Wall of Roots, which is a 0/5 defender that you can give a -0/-1 counter, which stacks with -1/-1 counters differently, by the way.
But yeah, if you give it that counter, you can add green to your mana pool, but you only get to do it once each turn.
Correct.
So it's just one of those that there are dorks at 2, and there's some dorks at 3, but those kind of fall off pretty quickly. We're looking primarily at 1 and 2 drops for mana dorks.
You forgot the king of them all, Eric. The king of the elves. Actually,
yes,
I don't even think he was a king. I think he was just some loser.
Well, he's Rafellos Llanowar Emissary, so I'm pretty sure he's not a king if he's an emissary.
There we go. His art is hideous, too.
It is pretty bad. He's green for a 2/1 Elf Legend, and you can tap to add 1 green mana to your mana pool for each forest you control. When we were putting this list together, you were talking about maybe this being more of a combo-oriented card than a mana dork, and I can see where you're coming from. But, I mean, it does still do the whole dork thing of it's a creature that you can play early that taps for mana, but
He's a dork, but he's hardly ever fair.
that's true. So I think that kind of rounds out what we're looking at for mana dorks. Let's move into the actual ramp spells. These are the things that are actually going to get you lands into play, or they're not creatures that ramp you.
Yeah, these will be things that you tend to play on turns 2 and 3 in order to get to your fatty for turn 3 to 5, depending on what you're shooting for.
Right.
The classic one that kind of blurs the line from dork to ramp spell is Sakura Tribe Elder, affectionately nicknamed Steve.
Yep.
He's a 1/1 for 1 and a green. You can sacrifice him to rampant growth.
And yeah, does kind of blur the lines because it's like a creature that's getting you mana.
But he's not around to see it.
Yeah, so it's doing it in like a roundabout way, so it's sort of a ramp spell, but it's pretty good.
We've got the classic duo of Cultivate and Kodama's Reach.
Right.
And then there's a pair of 1-drops that are worth mentioning. One, technically not a 1-drop, but it's a 1-drop. We've got Search for Tomorrow, the most confused 1-drop to ever have 3 mana up in the corner of the card.
Right, and this one's pretty sweet. It's, like you said, 2 and a green for a sorcery, and it says search your library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield. Then shuffle your library. Note that it's not tapped. It also has an alternate casting cost of suspend 2 for just a green. The other 1-drop was Utopia Sprawl, which is green for an enchantment aura. You can enchant a forest. As Utopia Sprawl comes into play, choose a color. Whenever enchanted forest is tapped for mana, its controller adds 1 mana of the chosen color.
Arbor Elf's Unboltable Best Friend.
Yes. Yeah, it is pretty nice when you can do Arbor Elf into Utopia Sprawl. That said, Utopia Sprawl is just solid on its own as well. Like, it's a 1 mana that turns your forest into tapping for 2.
I would say the final ramp spell to discuss would be the Signets or Talismans.
Right, and I was going to say, we do have to discuss them because Signets and Talismans are still ramp, and you can still play them in your green decks. When we were talking about this topic, we tried not to have ramp in general, like, because there's an artifact ramp deck as well, but you can still play Signets in your green ramp deck. They're fine.
They're honestly a good idea to include in some quantity, simply because they're not removable by Doomblade or by Lightning Bolt. All of the classic ways to remove creatures don't hit Signets. It diversifies the way you ramp up. It makes it a lot harder for you to get blown out by a single type of removal spell.
Right. That said, it is one of those that the Signets are going to be valued higher in the draft for the other drafters. So it's kind of a balance of when you pick it versus everything else. But we'll get into that later. So I think we're on to the other big part of ramp, which is how do you win the game? So we're talking fatties.
Yeah, so these are your big payoff cards, whatever you happen to want. They don't have to be in green, obviously, even though you're a green ramp deck, because a lot of ramp doesn't care about what color it makes.
Right. Green is got the easiest chance of splashing into any color.
But that being said, green also is supposed to be the color of big creatures.
That's true.
Whether or not Wormcoil Engine knows about that fact is up in the air.
Yeah. Thanks, Wizards.
Let's start out with the only thing in green to ever give Wormcoil Engine a run for its money in any way, Carnage Tyrant.
Yeah, Carnage Tyrant is 4 green for a 7/6 dinosaur. Carnage Tyrant can't be countered, and then it has Trample and Hexproof. This is a solid way to win games.
Yeah.
Especially against the control players.
It's sinfully boring, but you can never beat it for efficiency.
Right.
You can move up a mana and find Hornet Queen, who won't win the game the fastest, but is one of the more inevitable ones that actually works the best when you're behind.
It's true. So you're getting 5 creatures with flying and death touch. One of them's a 2/2 and the rest are 1/1s. It's not the fastest clock, but like you said, there's a lot of inevitability going on there.
Moving up to 8 mana in green, there's at least 4 options worth mentioning. Well, 3 worth mentioning in Craterhoof Behemoth.
I think Craterhoof Behemoth is one of the more iconic ones just because it's been around for a while and it does nasty stuff in Constructed. It's pretty nice when you're using your mana dorks to ramp into it, but you know, if you're using the actual ramp spells, it kind of loses some of its oomph.
Although, if you're using mana dorks to ramp into it, it also loses its oomph because they're tapped and can't swing.
That is one of the problems with it as well.
It's a combo card.
It
literally exists for natural order. The card's not very good when played at face value.
Sure. I mean, it works well with, like, Gaia's Cradle, but whatever. Yeah, it's
I would
card.
much rather, in any fair deck, play Endray's Forerunners.
Yeah, this one's kind of new. Endray's Forerunners is 5 green for a 7/7 with Vigilance, Trample, and Haste, and when it enters the battlefield, other creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain Vigilance and Trample until end of turn. Has a similar effect where it's trying to overrun the board so you can swing, but it leaves behind a 7/7 with Trample and Vigilance instead of a 5/5.
So if you don't win the game on the spot, like with Craterhoof Behemoth, it leaves behind a vanilla 5/5, where with this guy, there's slightly less chance you win the game exactly on the spot than Craterhoof has, but it leaves behind a 7/7 Trample Vigilance, which is a much more respectable body and has a much higher chance of winning the game in the long run if you couldn't go for the combo kill.
Right, and it's still going to try and push some damage through so that 7/7 can probably finish the game.
Then we've got probably the most classic example, which is Woodfall Primus, a card that has been natural ordered 4 in cubes since 2008.
Yeah, I don't know when that came out exactly, but it's been doing work for a long time. Woodfall Primus is 5 green for a 6/6 Treefolk Shaman with Trample. When it enters the battlefield, destroy a target non-creature permanent, and it has Persist. So, respectable body, has Trample for a 6/6, and when it comes into play, destroy something. They deal with it, and it comes back, and it destroys something again, and it's still a 5/5 Trample. It's pretty decent.
And rounding it out, we've got Terrastodon, the Jack of all trades, destroyer of Jace the Mind Sculptors.
Yeah, Terrastodon is 6 green for a 9/9 elephant, and when it enters the battlefield, you may destroy up to 3 target non-creature permanents. For each permanent put in the graveyard this way, its controller puts a 3/3 green elephant creature token onto the battlefield.
Hint, almost always give them 2 elephants and you 1 elephant.
So those are like the primary ones in green, but like we said before, you can branch out. We've got some solid colorless ones like Mere Battlesphere, Sundering Titan, Karn, Ugin.
Wormcoil Engine.
Wormcoil Engine, yeah.
There's also the super high-end ones in things like the Eldrazi.
Right.
I'm not always a fan of including them in your cube. I'm currently running no Eldrazi. But that being said, I have previously run up to 3 Eldrazi at one time. It depends. They end up being very narrow in the decks that can support them.
Right.
But they win the game pretty much, I'd say 85% of the time once cast.
Yeah, those big Eldrazi are definitely solid win the game targets.
Then once we move into our secondary colors, we get things like splashing into red. You can get Emissary of Grudges, Inferno Titan, Dragon Lord Atarka in green-red. Blue gives us all of the classic big blue cards, whether it be just something as simple as a Consecrated Sphinx or an Aetherling, into something more splashy and fun, like the new Hydroid Krasis.
Right.
White and black, I find, are less drafted in ramp in my cube, but those even have things like Elish Norn or Grave Titan as options.
Right.
It's worth noting that you don't just have to ramp into fatties either. There are also ramping into large spells. Upheaval famously ends games by casting it with a bunch of mana left over to replay your board before you pass turn.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
There's always ramping out an early Wildfire to make the game one-sided, although it's trickier in green decks than for the non-green version of Wildfires in my opinion.
Yeah, but it's still pretty respectable, I think.
And you've just got things like large X spells or high-end planeswalkers like Will Kenrith and Elspeth Sun's Champion to round it out.
Yeah, it's one of those that, like, you can grab the top end to the control decks and just play them 2 turns early, and that's pretty decent.
Before we get to the fatties, we want to do something in the middle for those cases where we don't get the perfect hand to get one of those out on turn 3 or 4.
This is the rest of your curve. It's not the 1-drop. It's not the 8-drop.
Yeah, this is where things come into play, like Garruk Wildspeaker, or the Nissas, or a certain green 5-drop sorcery that puts 2 lands on top of your opponent's library. I'm just saying. Turn 3 Plow Under, followed by turn 4 Plow Under, followed by turn 5 Plow Under has ended friendships before.
Yeah, that is something you can do. But yeah, there's actually quite a lot of these general curve fillers that kind of do what you still want to do.
You'll find a lot of planeswalkers fit well at this point in the curve. They cause a threat that your opponent has to deal with while you get to your high drop that you're trying to get to. They also have the option of digging or putting out blockers on board to stall out the faster decks that are trying to go under you.
Right.
And then we've got the more conservative ways to win the game that are a bit saner. This is when you can bleed the ramp deck into the mid-range decks by just being elves that get to 5 drops real fast.
Right.
Things like Deranged Hermit, Biogenic Ooze, even Acidic Slime just being one of the best utility cards for that.
Yeah.
Everyone's favorite, Thrag Tusk.
Yes, yeah, and Verdurous Gearhulk's solid because it can create 2 threats with its +1/+1 counters on an elf or something like that.
And this is without getting into the other colors, where you could end up things like Ilrog or Glorybringer in red.
So there's another aspect to ramp, which is a combo nature. And one of the primary things in the combo nature of ramp would be natural order.
Yes, Natural Order is a sorcery for 2 green. As an additional cost to cast Natural Order, you must sacrifice a green creature. You search your library for a different green creature, put it onto the battlefield, and shuffle your library. Famously, this is things like turn 3, sacrifice your elf, get Woodfall Primus, blow up one of their lands, have a 6/6 trample that when they remove it, comes right back as a 5/5 trample and blows up another one of their lands.
Yeah, or just doing the same thing except a Carnage Tyrant, which turn 3 Carnage Tyrant is probably going to win the game.
Hornet Queen is always a safe bet in that too.
Right.
Or if the board is somewhat filled up at this point, this is where you grab your Endraze Forerunners or your Craterhoof Behemoth to get for the combo kill.
Right. That's not to say that like Natural Order is only good on turn 3. It's still searching for your fatty. It's essentially another threat in the deck. So if you're in top deck mode and you grab a Natural Order, you probably have an elf sitting around, turn it into one of your threats.
There is a different interesting combo 4-drop in green, which would be Eureka.
Right. Eureka is a 4-drop sorcery. Starting with you, each player may put a permanent card from their hand onto the battlefield. Repeat this process until no one puts a card onto the battlefield. This one creates an interesting sub-game of, do you have the biggest threats and the most of them, or do they? Or do they have, the Palace Jailer to sort of answer whatever you're going to play?
Yes, and I think in a lot of the more Planeswalker-based decks, Eureka beats Natural Order by a long shot because rather than have 1 or 2 targets maybe that are really good and then maybe a backup target, you end up with, I've got a grip full of value engine Planeswalkers. I'm just going to cast Eureka. If they don't counter it, I'm going to value them out of this game within 3 turns.
Right.
And it can turn what would be an alright mid-range deck into a very scary combo style deck.
Right, but you're still probably going to try and support all of that with ramp so you can actually play those higher end Planeswalkers early.
Correct. And it works well bridging the gap between those 2 decks because you can play 5 or 6 mid-rangey Planeswalker cards and 5-drop creatures that are really decent, and also just have the big dumb idiots at the top end of the curve that you can also cheat out with the same Eureka.
Right. We've also got the classic Channel, which is absolutely a combo card.
I hear the combo was so good that some store online decided to name themselves after it. I think they're called Star City Games.
Yeah, maybe. Something like that. That sounds about right.
Obviously with Channel, if you're running Channel, the Eldrazi get a lot better because colorless mana lets you get to the biggest, dumbest win conditions incredibly fast.
Right.
Things like Ugin gain a lot with Channel.
Yeah, definitely. And, I mean, it's a pretty busted card.
Yeah. I don't recommend it in Unpowered unless you really like playing weird combo stuff, but power to you if you want to do something weird.
Yeah, and it fits in this whole ramp style of, sometimes you don't always get to play Channel. Sometimes you don't draw it. So you still need to be able to play these Eldrazi's eventually. And ramping into them is completely possible.
Then we get into the larger cheat into play cards. These are ones where you're not really cheating the curve so much as you're cheating the deck. These are things like Tooth and Nail, Zavala Stampede, Planar Bridge. So Planar Bridge is a 6-drop artifact. You can pay 8 and tap it to search your library for any permanent and put it into play. Planar Bridge obviously gets real nutty after you've started activating it once or twice, and you can just keep going the rest of the game like that until they can solve it, and then you still have whatever it's brought out.
Right, and all of these are, like you said, not cheating on the curve. They're cheating in the deck construction because you'll be able to get the fatties and whatever is the best thing at the time for whatever the board state is. And it works out pretty well when you're able to tutor stuff from your deck into play. Speaking of tutoring stuff into play, we've got Green Sun Zenith and the new Finale of Devastation. These, I don't know if I would really consider them combo. I think they're more like draw effects.
Yeah, they fall more into line with Fauna Shaman and Survival of the Fittest on the filtering, drawing, tutoring portion of the deck rather than a flat-out combo piece like with the others that are really cheating things out. Speaking of, let's real quick run you through. Survival of the Fittest is 1 and a green for an enchantment, and it has pay a green, discard a creature card, search your library for a creature card, reveal it, put it into your hand, shuffle your library.
This is great because this turns your mana dorks that you don't need anymore into the fatties that you haven't drawn.
Green Sun, Finale of Devastation, all of those fit into that digging through the library, trying to find your game-ending creatures. Or if it's early game, you may have to chuck something that's a game-ending creature or pay less mana into one of the Zenith effects to just get another ramp guy.
Yeah, or some of the general support cards because you need to blow up an enchantment, so you grab a Reclamation Sage.
Yeah, never feel bad about tutoring up a Reclamation Sage. That is the correct option on many occasions.
Right.
I would say, as a side note, with the digging stuff, blue being splashed into your deck gives you all of blue's card draw we're not going to get into. That's a great alternative when you don't have these, to just grab blue as your secondary color or your tertiary color in the deck just to gain access to the draw.
Right, which is, like we said earlier, it's really easy to splash into multiple colors when you're playing green. So if you're lacking some of the card draw effects in green, so like the Green Suns, just getting the card draw from blue works out pretty well. The other thing to note when we're talking about all of this is we haven't really brought up interacting with your opponent. So we haven't brought up like removal spells, that type of stuff. Gramp doesn't really get much.
We get certain things. So like Song of the Dryads is a classic one that turns any permanent into a forest.
Right, for 2 and a green.
Yep.
So it does get some, but these are not top tier removal. I would not compare that to the white and black and red removal spells.
No, splashing into red removal is quite common in a ramp deck.
Yeah.
Splashing into blue for bouncing type removal is also quite common.
And sometimes you get some white or black removal, but that tends to end up more mid-rangey than an actual dedicated ramp deck pretty quickly. One of the things with ramp is that the idea is you don't need to answer what your opponent's doing if you've played bigger, scarier stuff quicker. So if you're playing turn 3 Carnage Tyrants, probably don't need to answer whatever they're doing.
Yeah, a 6/6 trample on turn 3 is going to win the game pretty fast. It's up to your opponent to have to waste their turns on removal while you apply pressure.
Right. So the ramp decks can kind of get away with not having these interaction with the opponent because you're the one forcing the interaction, be it either bolting the bird or having the removal spell or board wipe or whatever for your actual threats that you powered out.
Now, it's worth noting the difference between a mid-range deck and a ramp deck tends to be the amount of targets and the amount of dedicated ramp cards. Having 2 or 3 elves in your deck and ending up with 1 or 2 6-drops as the top of your curve does not make you a ramp deck.
No.
That's a mid-range deck.
Yes.
A ramp deck is actively attempting to break curve every game that it plays. Mid-range decks, if they don't draw the elf in the opener, are probably still filled with removal and generic value creatures and planeswalkers and whatever else, and are perfectly happy as they stand.
Right.
If a ramp deck opens up a 7 and it's got 4 lands, 2 6-drops, and a 5-drop, they're in trouble.
I think it's pretty obvious when you actually lay out your deck in a CMC curve. If the curve looks very low and top heavy, you're probably doing ramp. If it's kind of a normal curve, probably mid-range.
So let's get into how you draft ramp.
Okay. One of the first things is you're going to need to prioritize the actual ramp cards, so that being the dorks and the ramp spells, over your fatties. And that's because you need more. You need like the 7 to 10 ramp versus the 5 to 6 targets. And at the same time, those mid-range decks are going to look to getting the elves, not the Terastodons.
Yes, and you have an easier time picking up off-color fatties, whereas elves are always going to be your on-color, must-be green things.
Right. Absolutely.
If you're ramping elves into an Inferno Titan, you don't really care versus a Prime Time. It's all the same in the end because you'll be able to fix your mana by the time you're at 6 mana in a ramp deck.
Yes.
But picking up the turn 1 elf, you don't get a second option. So this means there will be many packs where you open it up and you're playing ramp solidly in the middle of pack 2 and you see Llanowar elves sitting next to Terastodon or whatever. Even if you're a little light on fatties at the time, I'm probably still picking up the elf because of how easy it is to get a fatty later. If for some reason I have a glut of elves, maybe I'll look at the fatty, but it's really hard to argue to myself.
I would have to have 6 elves already.
Yeah.
Like if I had
really
6,
hurting for fatties.
I probably don't need the 7th. You need to prioritize the actual ramp because other people are going to take it, and if you don't have the ramp, you're never going to be able to get to the fatties. And the other thing is like the tier 2 fatties are still good enough usually.
Yeah, they still end games.
Like if you're powering it out on your ramp curve, so it being playing your 6 drops on turn 3 or something like that, even if it's not the best, if it's second best, third best, or whatever, it's still probably good enough because you're cheating it so much earlier than whatever your opponent's doing.
Another key pickup is going to be your fixing. Things like dual lands are fantastic in ramp decks because it's so easy for you to tutor up lands as part of your ramp spells.
And like you said, that makes it that much easier to get those splashes of the actual fatties that are in off colors that kind of wheel around that you can just pick up easily.
And it's also very important to make sure the lands you're picking up are good lands that tap for green as well, because you're going to want to make sure no matter how many colors you're splashing, you always have an opener where you've got green mana available for a turn 1 elf play.
Right, because you really, really need turn 1 a ramp, be it an elf or even, maybe a Utopia Sprawl, but you have to have that turn 1 play, basically.
After all your key cards are picked up, you can usually round out packs by grabbing good cards in your splash colors or picking up good mid-rangey fallback options for if things aren't working out.
Right.
Garrick is always a good pick.
It's very easy for a ramp deck that fails to audible into a mid-range deck that's fine. So picking up some of these mid-range E-type cards when there's nothing else, that there's not an elf and there's not a dual land, picking up these mid-range cards are solid.
This is also where you'll pick up things like your removal spells, your filtering,
right?
Things like that go into the rest of what you're picking through packs.
So the other things to look out for during the draft is the sub-archetypes that pair well with ramp. So this being other cheat into play archetypes so that you can cheat those big fatties into play, be it sneak attack or through the breach or whatever.
Show and tell being one of my favorites.
There's also, like we alluded to earlier, wildfire actually can work pretty well with elves.
Let's talk about the problems the deck faces.
There's some big problems with ramp that we can't ignore. One of the primary ones is drawing the wrong half of the deck at the wrong time.
Yes, every deck has that problem to some extent.
Right.
But ramp's exaggerated curve makes that problem worse.
Yeah, it definitely takes that problem and pumps it up to 11.
Another one is ramp just has notoriously bad matchup. 2 of the famous one-sided matchups when I asked general other cube owners on Twitter, what's your most one-sided matchup you would never want to be on the receiving end of, was ramp versus control and ramp versus the burn deck.
Right, and that's because, so the ramp versus the burn deck it's just a straight up race. Who gets to kill the opponent first, and you're trying to both end it by turn 4, basically.
And they win every time because they have removal and you don't.
Almost always, they can both turn you back a turn and get enough damage in. And the control is they need to They basically just need to counter one primary thing.
Yeah, you're going to have a low threat density against a control deck versus things like a general mid-range deck where they're just filled with 4 and 5 drop value dudes.
Right.
And anyone that gets down can start taking over a game. You're going to have 4 or 5 key cards in your entire deck that they have to counter, and they're good.
Yeah, and if they can't counter it, maybe they've got a board wipe or a removal spell.
Or they just take it from you.
Yeah, or just take it.
So while green has historic problems, it's getting solutions every single set. Ramp is one of those few decks that can observedly get better every single set.
Yeah, there's usually something. Sometimes it's not exciting, but other times it's Carnage Tyrant. So,
all right, with that wonderful look towards the horizon, let's move on out to our outro.
sounds good.